Hello, everyone from Piano Teacher Central. My name is Bradley Mahalik, and I live in Western New York. I am the owner of BMMCreate.com and also Carl Barone Piano Tuning that services the greater Buffalo, New York area. Today, I'm going to go through a tutorial just because I know with our current state of things, it's been very hard to get anybody to come into our home to service our pianos. And most of our instruments need a lot of servicing. And I apparently didn't turn down my own volume, so I get to hear myself on repeat. But I know a lot of people have been struggling with getting their instrument maintained, especially if you're still teaching lessons online and the instrument's getting a lot of use. Piano teachers usually need to have their instruments tuned several times a year, and if someone can't come out to your house, then just kind of stuck unless we have some basic skills. So this tutorial is really to kind of nurture your interest and curiosity and also give you a knowledgeable base to run with. So in times like this, if there was something that you had to do, you would have a little bit of an idea of, should I do that? Should I touch that? Or is it something that I should wait on? At the same time, what you're going to learn today will never replace your professional technician. Professional technician has spent hours and hours of hammer time, hundreds of hours of hammer time, just to get good at the tuning aspects, not to mention all the other components and parts that are part of an instrument. But as I mentioned in the information video, almost every other instrumentalist really has some basic maintenance skills on their instrument. Brass players know how to adjust the tensions on their springs and how to fix some minor things when they have trouble, or spit corks. And woodwind players, of course, know how to replace their pads and adjust their springs and all their tension screws. But when it comes to us piano players, we really rely on somebody else because our instrument is so complicated. So hopefully you enjoy today and learn a little bit something as we go through the process. If you want more information, you can always email me. You can check out my website, and I also recommend checking out your local Piano Technicians Guild. They'll have information and resources for you too. As I mentioned in the info video, doing everything free to teach everybody a little bit about their instrument, hopefully help you out during. I'd ask if you get a moment to, or right now, just click subscribe and join my page, so that way when I do put things up, you have access to it and I can reach more audiences. So first thing first, in order to be able to do anything on your instrument, you have to be able to access what you need. Now I'm working on a grand piano right now. It's actually been pretty well maintained, so I got to have a little fun earlier knocking a couple of keys out of tune intentionally for our purposes today. But a grand piano, it doesn't get much easier. You open up your lid and you take off your music deck and it's all right there, right in front of you. However, at the same time, if you're going to be working on an upright, those can be a little bit more complicated. So I have several instruments located here, and I chose one to show you just a little video earlier in the day. So if you have an upright and you don't already know how to access it, just to give you a little bit of information on it. So here's just a little bit of information on how to access your upright. For those of you guys that have uprights, getting access to your strings and to your pins won't be quite as simple as it is on a grand, but it's still in most models pretty easy to accomplish. All pianos have some kind of lid on top. So in the case of this upright, we just have to lift up the top. If you've got a larger one, very often the top folds back, just half of it, or in some cases they actually have an entire top that removes. But more than likely, you're going to find one that's just going to lift up. Located at the top and at the sides is going to be some sort of locking mechanism to keep this board from moving out of place. Sometimes it's as simple as a little pin. or you might need a screwdriver. It could be screwed directly into the side walls of the cabinet of the piano. Or sometimes there's even just some like hinge locks. Kind of easy on this one. There's just a little locking mechanism. So if I flip it backwards, it comes off the pins, and then I can just lift this board right up and out of the way. Now I picked this piano just to show you some of the other things that you might encounter. This does have a practice pedal component as well, and a soft pedal component. This will definitely get in the way of your pins and your mutes. If you find one of these, or you may even find on some pianos the little tacks to give kind of a honky-tonk sound. They're just attached to a bar. Even though you'll see screws in all sides, usually you just need to remove screws on one side, and then on another side a pin goes right into the cabinet, and then you can move that out of the way as well, and now you have access to your pins. Of course, the big one that you might find in the way, if you have a player piano, then there's going to be a lot of things in the way. You're going to have the main player unit right in the front and in the center, all the little individual key bellows, lots of pipes and hoses that go to it. My recommendation, if you have one of those pianos, is that you do need to wait for a technician. That's not something that you want to try to take out by yourself. If what needs to be fixed up or tuned up is something that you can access your strings with the mutes and your hammer without having to move anything out of the way, then you might be okay just to do one or two things that might be bothering you till your technician can come. But otherwise, if you run into a player unit, I would definitely avoid touching it altogether. Definitely don't try to remove it. They're very delicate. Most of them are pretty old too, and may not function the same if you mess with the wrong thing. So I forgot to mention before, for those of you guys who are watching live right now, I will do my best to try to monitor the chat feed. If you do have any questions of some particular problems that you might have been having during the pandemic and while things were shut down, and you're wondering if there's anything that you can do about it till you can get somebody at your house, feel free to type something in there, and I'll try to check it as we go along, and at least try to give you an answer, let you know what to expect when you do have a technician come out. But if it's a problem we can talk about and I could show you something here, I certainly will. So when a technician comes to your house, and before you attempt to do anything, there's a couple things that you really want to check over on your instrument. And this is probably one of the most important things, because as you all know, if you break a string, well, then you're without that string, depending on which one it is. That could eliminate that note entirely, or definitely will affect the tone of the note. And then when you finally do get the string replaced, it's going to go out of tune continuously until that string really gets stretched and worn into the instrument the way it belongs to. So you don't want to start touching things if there's even the possibility you're going to be breaking strings. But whenever your technician comes to do some maintenance on the piano, they're also going to check out a couple of things. I'm going to show you that right now, because those are all good things for you to be checking out as well. So then if you notice something when your technician does come, even if it's something you're not going to handle on your own, you're able to say, I noticed that this is happening, or this seemed out of place. They should be checking it anyways, but if you're aware of it too, it's something you can ask and draw their attention to. So I'm going to take you up close to a couple of things that I recommend that you check out before you even begin touching your instrument. So I'm just going to switch over to camera here so we can give you a little closer view of what's going on. So one of the things that we want to make sure we really take a good look at all the time is our soundboard. And when I first look at an instrument, I'm checking the soundboard to see, does it look clean? Is there any cracks in it? Is there any debris that's maybe fallen in it that would start to buzz or start to rattle around? So I check the soundboard. Obviously, if there's a crack or anything like that, that's something that is always a concern you want to ask your technician about, if it's something that you got to leave alone or if you got to start doing some kind of maintenance for, so that way you can take care of, or if it's something that needs an immediate repair, because it certainly could be the end of an instrument in a hurry if you get the right kind of crack, or a very expensive repair depending on how that crack is. The other thing I check is the cleanliness. Now, this instrument I clean pretty regularly, but it hasn't been cleaned in a while. So looking at this soundboard under the light, you can tell that it looks pretty clean. If I look around my pins, though, you can see that some stuff has already fallen in there, and certainly what I can see here a little bit easier is going to be on that soundboard as well. Cleanliness is so important for an instrument. Dust is the absolute enemy. When dust is sitting on the instrument, it can create excess dryness, and when we're humid, the dust can hold the moisture and create a new set of problems. You can have the parts of your instrument that are fabric or felt start to mold on you. You can have things start to rot. So we all know that if you were to take one of these hammers, for instance, outside and have it soaked and just leave it sit out there in the rain and all that, it would get pretty disgusting after a while. And if you have dust on there and have a humid climate, you can have some problems because of that. So we check the general cleanliness of the instrument. We check the dampers. We like to make sure that all the dampers look like they're the right height and that they look nice and straight. When we talk about cleaning, we're going to talk about how to care for those and make sure that you're very careful if you ever touch anything on those. And then we also look down underneath to the hammers just to make sure that they all look like they're sitting relatively level, and that when we see the indents, we don't start to see new grooves that are being made in to the hammer. That could be an indication that something's moved out of regulation. Can't tell you how often you look at a piano and the hammer is only hitting 2 or even 1 of the strings when it's supposed to be hitting all 3. So that's something you want to check. And if you see anything, that's something to definitely draw your attention to and make your technician aware of. Now, for us, if we're going to talk about tuning, what we want to check is we want to look at our pin area. And I'll check this too, especially if it's a tuning that I'm going to be moving the pitch pretty drastically, because I want to know what the likelihood of a string breaking is and how I have to approach the instrument when I tune it. Now, this instrument has been restored fairly recently. There's really not going to be any rust buildup, but what I'm looking is right at the coil and at this part of the pin for any rust buildup. Because if I were to see some rust buildup in there, that would be something that would be a red flag to me, and I would have to be extremely cautious. If you look at your pins and you see rust buildup, I would recommend that you don't touch it. There's a chance, not necessarily. There's a lot of pianos that have rust on them. In fact, even some of these strings that are newer, they've got some rust in some areas, and they could use a little bit of cleaning in that regard if I wanted to. But if that pin and that string is rusted together, then as soon as you turn it, there's a good chance that right at the coil, it's going to snap, and I'm going to break a string. So we want to check that area. The other area, likewise, that we want to check is back by the hitch pins. So on all our mid and treble strings, most people aren't aware of this, but one string actually wraps around the hitch pin and comes back around to the other side, and therefore one string even maybe actually on 2 different notes, doing 2 different pitches, and it wraps around the hitch pin. So we want to check at that point, make sure there's no rust. The bass strings are a little bit different. When you look at the bass strings, they're obviously single, and they have the wound steel and then the loop to go over the hitch pin. But same thing. Those are areas where we want to look for rust, as well as they go over the string guides if there's anything rusted. All those points of contact, if there's rust, then when the string flexes and when it stretches, that rust could create a sticky part, and we could end up breaking a string. So if you're inspecting your instrument and you look at that and you see any rust, my advice to you would be don't touch it just yet. I would say stay away from it for a moment and wait for your technician, because there is a possibility that you could break the strings. Now, if you know that your piano also has broken strings pretty regularly, that's another red flag. If your technician's broken them, then obviously there's a good chance, if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to break your strings as well. If you have a relatively new instrument, if you're not sure, it's always best to leave it alone, but you're probably going to be pretty safe. If you don't see rust, as long as you're careful, you're probably going to be pretty safe. So let's start getting into talking about the tuning just a little bit here. If you watch the information video that I made, I tried to give you a heads up on some of the things that you could get before you watch this video. I know there'll be more people watching the video after today, and perhaps if you rewatch it or when they watch it, we'll be able to have a tool that you can look at. But this is a professional tuning hammer. As I mentioned in the video, it's made of a rosewood. It's very sturdy, it's very balanced. It has the star tip on the end, and those are the things, the star tip especially, that you want to make sure that you have before you put your hammer on your tuning pins. I know this is redundant if you watch the info video, but again, you want to be very cautious when you're using your doing anything on your instrument. There are things that will fit on your instrument. For instance, they make the drum keys that actually have the levers. I do work with marching band, and because we tighten those so much, there's nice levers on those. You could actually turn a piano pin with those. I wouldn't recommend that you put anything but the star tip on your pins, because if you start to wear those down in any way, they're really in there, especially if you got a good instrument, and you're going to have a hard time if you do damage to your pins. So make sure that you got a hammer. If you're just getting one for an occasional need, at least make sure it has the star tip. And obviously, the better the quality, then you're going to start to get into where you're able to adjust this to get different height lengths. If you're going to be running into parts of the piano, or if you need to extend it, this one's an extension, so I can pull it out if I need to. I find I don't need to very often. I like to use this length. When I mount, I can feel things very well with it, and I'm used to it, so I don't need to really touch too much on it. So when you put your tuning pin on, I'm just going to find the string that I'm going to be, or your tuning hammer on, you want to make sure that it's affixed all the way down. You don't want to be floating up on top. You want to make sure that it goes all the way down to the bottom, so that way you're going to be able to feel your pin the best. I'm actually going to switch my view so you can start to see what we're doing here a little bit. So I'm going to go over to the first note we're going to be working on, and I'm going to just push that all the way down, make sure it's on all the way, and that we have a good grip. And I think right now I'm just going to change the angle of that a little bit for us. Now, you don't ever pull over the strings or cross the strings. So, especially on an upright, you could find yourself doing this, depending where you're at. If I put the hammer on like this, I'm pulling over the strings. That's not a good way to tune the piano. You're not going to get a good feel over what you're doing. And also note, if the string were to snap, well, now you got your hand right over the top of it, and you don't want to be worrying about that. So we always try to pull across the strings. We put our hammer so that way we're pulling across the strings, or as perpendicular to the strings as possible. Whatever arm you're going to use to tune with, you want to make sure it's anchored to something. You want to be able to feel tension at all times. We're going to be talking about that in just a second. You want to be able to feel tension at all times. And by anchoring, you're able to feel how you're moving, and also give yourself some support when you're starting to turn especially tight pins. So just a couple points of review. Make sure that you're all the way on the pin. Never pull or turn your hammer across the strings. And then have your arm anchored when you're getting ready to tune. And then you're going to have to find which way is comfortable and gives you the best feel, which, I have my way that I like to do it, but if I'm on a piano that's got looser pins, I might do some things a little bit more with my fingers so that I can feel a little bit differently. It all depends on the instrument. And if you're only touching your own, you might get used to just what the feel and what the touch is with that rather quickly. Even if you have perfect pitch, use a tuner. I know it's impressive when you can see somebody that can tune completely by ear. I don't have perfect pitch, so I couldn't give you a perfect A440 without having my tuner with me. And but I could tune a piano completely by ear to whatever's there. And I've definitely come across pianos where somebody's just come in and tuned by ear and didn't have perfect pitch. And every time it's been tuned and left, it sounds good, but it's been slowly dropping over time. And I've found pianos that have been tuned regularly and go in and they're actually almost a whole half step flat, even though to the player, they sound good. They've never played with a recording or with anybody else live. They had no idea that their instrument is just falling flat. So always use a tuner. It's gonna not only help you make sure that you get the right pitch, but even if you do have perfect pitch, if you've got a sensitive tuner, you're gonna see what the effect of the hammer is. There's a lot of finesse and touch that goes into using your tuning hammer. So even just some light pulls with the fingertips, they're going to start to affect what happens to the pins. And you have a visual representation of that too, especially when you're working on a single string. That's going to help you a lot when you're tuning. You've probably heard talks of temperament. Nowadays, most people have an equal tempered or an even tempered piano. So everything is tuned right at the absolute pitch. This has come into use a lot with the electronic instruments when things need to be tuned to electronics, or in today's concerts, if they even use a live piano, then they're going to be playing or maybe coordinating with MIDI. So our ears have gotten really used to just an even tempered piano. But if you're in different regions, and perhaps if you're watching and you're from another part of the world, perhaps you don't use even temperament the same way that we do here in the United States. If you're playing certain styles of music, or you're accustomed to having your piano done a certain way with a German temperament or whatnot, you're going to want to look for a tuner that has those, so that way you can assist yourself with really knowing what the variants are in order to make that temperament sound appropriate for you. Otherwise, if you just used a plain old tuner, you would end up with an even temperament, and you would probably not think it sounds in tune, even though the tuner says that everything's in tune for you. So just a couple of basics that we're going to talk about, and then we'll get into the actual moving of the pitch. You're going to be applying light pressure at all times once you begin. So if we're pulling a pitch up, once we start to feel that pressure on the pin, we're not going to let go of it until we've got it where it is. You're not turning the pin, so it's not like you're wrenching something. Well, you are turning the pin, but you don't want to have that feel or that illusion when you're doing it. So once you get pressure, you're going to slowly, if you're bringing the pitch up, you're going to give light pulls. And then once you start to see how that instrument and that string and pin responds, then you can start giving a little bit harder pulls if need be. But you're going to constantly leave the pressure on that hammer. You're not going to let go and then pull, and let go and then pull. Once we have the tension, we're going to keep the tension. And when we finally find and lock into our pitch, then we're going to try to pull just slightly over and let it relax if need be. Help it out with just a light touch with the fingers, and that's going to set the pin. If we don't do that, it's going to go right out of tune right away. So setting the pin is one of those important skills that your technician has that's going to make your instrument tuning last. And that might be one of the most difficult things at first when you try. You'd say, oh, I found it, I got it in tune, but it didn't stay in tune. And that's because we didn't set the pin. So we always have to remember those few things. Keep constant pressure on the hammer, whichever way that we're going. We're probably going to be going, well, I know we're going up because I detuned a couple things on us on purpose. And we're going to keep constant pressure on it. Then when we find that, we're looking for like a 1/2 cent to 1 cent over pull, and then relax in. So that way we know that that's really going to be in the right place. So again, pulls, not just turning, and then we're on our way. So I've got some mutes here. We're going to be looking at the A string. I know that this is a little bit hard to see right now. I'm just going to shoot the camera this way. But your mutes are going to help you. Oh, and I'm going to give you a tuner to view here. As I mentioned in the tutorial, I do use my iPad most of the time. So what you're seeing up at the top there is a visual of my iPad. I love that when I turn it vertically, it still gives me 25 cents sharp and flat. It doesn't change it, even though the screen's so wide. So that just makes it super sensitive. I have the larger iPad, so it's a good 6 inches from 0 to plus 25. So I can really see how that pin's moving, and it picks up the range of the instrument very well. So that's become my favorite thing to tune with, unless there's a reason that I need to use one of the other tuners that I mentioned in the info video. So here's the A that I had fun messing up earlier. Hopefully, as it translates to you at home, it sounds pretty bad. I moved a lot of things around for you. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my mutes, and I'm going to find those strings. And I can check out what each one's doing right now with my tuner. If I just look at the string on my left right now, which correlates with the top pin, you can see from the tuner that as it settles, it starts to fall 10 cents flat. Almost 10 cents flat. I'm now going to listen to the string all the way on my right, the one that correlates with the lower pin. That one's just a little bit flat, and if I grab one more mute here and I mute on either side, I actually have a special mute for doing this, but this will work for right now. And I just listen to the middle. Middle's almost where we want it to be, but not quite. So I'm going to start with the first pin right now. So I'm going to stick my mute right in between the second and third strings. Very important. Make sure once you've set your mute and you know what string, if you're doing this for the first time, and I still do this depending on what the angle of the instrument is and how things cross each other, take a good look at that string that you're going to tune and follow it all the way up to the pin. Because there's definitely, you're wondering what's going wrong when you're starting to pull on the pin and you don't see any response from the tuner. And there's a good chance that you're on the wrong string when that happens. Or worse yet, it's a real, an instrument that really, the strings don't show much movement at first. And you keep pulling on it, thinking you haven't moved it yet, or you're giving harder pulls on a particular instrument. And you're moving the wrong string the whole time. And you either ruin something that you already did some work on, or worse yet, you end up breaking a string because you're pulling on it. So, the strike of the key. That plays an important role. I hit the string multiple times. I hit it fairly hard. I want to make sure that I get that string vibrating, and that's just going to help with setting the pin, seeing where it's really balanced. But as you notice, I'll stop talking, you see a lot of drift in this particular piano. From where that pitch started to where that pitch ended up falling to. So I'm going to tune a little bit closer to the sustain of that note, because we're going to hear other sounds when we first strike the key. We're going to hear the sound of the hammer. We're going to hear the sound of the mechanism. We're going to hear the sound of the key hitting the bottom of the key bed. There's a lot of things that come into the beginning of that sound. So I'm going to focus more on the pitch that we hear when we start to get into the long sustain. So like I said before, I'm going to get a nice strong mount, anchor my arm on the instrument. I see that I'm flat. I'm going to apply a little bit of pressure, but I'm not moving it yet. And then when the time comes, I'm going to start to pull gently at first. I know how hard to pull this instrument, but I'm going to pretend that I don't. So I'm going to pull gently at first and watch how my pin starts to move. Once I start pulling, I'm not going to let go. I'm going to keep that pressure on. You see it hardly is moved. I'm pulling back still on the hammer. So I'll pull a little harder. I saw movement now. And that little bit, and I'm already over. Now I let go. Watch what happens. It just drops flat because I didn't set the pin. I just pulled it and then I just let go. That's why we don't let go. So now let's actually get this pin set. Put that pressure. Go just above. And ease it into place. And that's where I'm gonna end up putting this string. Now it's time to start tuning unison. So I'm gonna slide my tuning mute over. You can hear now the clash in the vibrations between those two pitch. This is where the ear takes over. I could use my tuner the exact same way on that string all by itself, lock it into the same place, and it still might not sound in tune, especially on this instrument. You saw how much wander there was in that string. So now is when we're going to be using our ears and we're going to be listening for the absolute stopping of those vibrations and that pure unison lock-in that hopefully you've been hearing for most of your life if you're a piano player. And that is one of the easier parts. If you've been playing your whole life on an in-tune instrument, you know what it's supposed to sound like. You know when it's there. So the real skill comes in the technique of how you're doing it and getting it to stay there. So when I tuned this before, I remember it was just slightly flat, wasn't quite there. So I should only have to pull it up just a little bit, and I'll probably hear it. And then I'm going to try to lock in a perfect unison with it. You can hear when we go too far how that pitch opens up and spreads. And now with those two strings, as I look at my tuner, just about a cent sharp. So if I wanted to be real picky with that, which I probably will be when I'm done, I could go back and try to finesse that even more just to get that to stay at that absolute zero. But I've got a nice clear tone right now. I'm happy with that. I'm going to look at our last string. I don't remember if I showed you our last string. So let me just mute the other two. That one's a little bit on the high side. Incidentally, I didn't, I thought I pulled it a little bit higher earlier and it must have already dropped a little bit. So what I would recommend that you do right now, even though that there's three strings there, tune it to only one other string. It's going to be a little bit easier to hear, especially if you have an instrument that the string pitch wanders a little bit. So this should not take much. I'm just going to mount my hand. I'm going to use my fingertips now. I'm just going to gently relax this pin back until I hear that unison. Now I'll take the mute out and listen to all three. And hopefully it sounds good to you at home. It sounds good here. So I've got that A tuned up. Now, one of the big questions is going to be, how do you proceed through the rest of the instrument? Because that's the procedure. And we just did that on one string. I took quite a long time to talk through that. Obviously, I'd be spending a long time at somebody's house if I was spending that much time on one string. So we have to get used to how an instrument feels and how it's responding rather quickly, so that way we can start moving through the instrument and be efficient too while we're working. But take all the time you need if you're touching your instrument at home. If you need to fix something up, you have something that's been moving, take all the time you need, because if you get it right and you don't hurt anything or move too quickly, it's much better than being too abrupt and being in a rush. So first thing that I do when I approach the instrument is I look at the different breaks in the instrument. So right now, between these bars on the harp, these sections on the harp, I've got this middle break. I know it's kind of out of your view, but there's the low end. And I have two more breaks on the top of the instrument. So when I first tune, I work just that center section. I work just that mid section. And then I usually start to move to the upper section. Then there's some different things depending on how far out of tune it was or whatnot. But within that section, I start on A. I worked on tuning that A440. Now that I have that, I'm going to find the other A's within this section that I'm working on, and I'm going to tune them to the octave. Here, you can use your combo of your ear and your tuner, so that way you make sure those really are locked in. So I'm going to mute the same way, two strings, so I'm just hearing one. I would also recommend, if you're tuning for the first time, mute down to just one string on the one that you already tuned. Just takes away a lot of movement that you might get from individual strings and just help you know that you've really locked in that octave. But we can see from the tuner that I'm a few cents flat. We already discovered it doesn't take much pressure. And I made the mistake that I just talked about before, because I didn't do my nice lineup before. So I was actually sitting on A flat. So now, even though I didn't mess up A flat and it was nice and in tune before, listen to how my A flat sounds now, just from that little bit there. That's how easy it is to get a pitch really far off. There we go. So now we'll take our time to check that A. Just a little pull, and it moved that much. Looks good, sounds good. I'm just going to make sure I give that little pull to make sure the pin sets. My octave sounds good. Now I'll just tune the unisons. And our last string. You hear it by itself. It's just a little sharp. and really just hardly doing anything on this particular instrument, and I get a lot of variation, a lot of change. There we go. So those happen to be the only two A's within this section. I take the mutes off. I've got a nice good sound on this end. Then I go through and I tune the fifths. And I work through fifths. So the E would be next. Then I unison the E's. The B's, octaves and unisons, F sharps, and so on until I get all the way around to D. And then I can check it with that beginning A. And when I'm just doing little movements like this on a well-maintained piano, it doesn't take a whole lot, and I shouldn't have very much movement, if any at all, in that A after just tuning it, and I should end up with a nice fifth, which I meant to play before you how bad that fifth would have sounded. But right now, the fifth sounds nice between the D and the A. We learned that they're perfect fifths. They're perfect because the vibrations are within each other. So even though they're moving at different frequencies, they move in coordination. So they can sound beatless to us, just like a unison can. So this E right now, it doesn't sound that bad. But earlier, I tuned the whole thing a little flat. So we're almost 10 cents flat. And when you hear the A's together, it sounds beatless. When you hear the D and the A together, because the D should be in tune on this instrument, it sounds beatless because that's a nice fifth. But when I play A and E's, those perfect fourths and fifths together, that 10 cents makes a big difference. Even though by itself, we've got an in-tune pitch. It's not set to the right frequency, so those fourths and fifths, when I play, I'm playing two A's and the E in between. Not a good sound. So same approach to tune the fifth. This will be the last one that I tune here, and then we'll talk about some other things. This whole thing's flat. Check that I'm on the right string. Anchor myself, apply that pressure. There I am above. And I'm going to relax. Went a little too high on that guy. And we're going to be pretty happy with that. If I check that with my fifth, there's a nice clean sound. And now I'll tune the unisons. Not really worried about the tuner right now. Light pulls, not letting go of the pressure. There it is in tune. So I go above, relax, and it fell. I pull it up and relax. Now, unfortunately, you're not able to feel what I was just able to feel there, but when I did that last little pull, I could feel the pin pop into a little spot. And in a nice, well-maintained piano, that's the notch. And you're going to know that you've got your pin in a nice spot where it's not going to move there. And when I detuned this before, I tried not to leave a notch, but I must have left the notch a little bit there. And I could feel myself pop right back into that notch. As that pin sunk in the wood with the tension of the string on it, it's going to pull. And the back end of the pin is going to be pulling out opposite of the direction of the strings, and it's going to make just a little indent in your pin block. And that notch is very important in keeping your pin set. That's why if you maintain your instrument, you get it tuned regularly, you're going to develop those notches. Your instrument's going to stay in tune longer, and it's going to be easier to tune when it needs to be tuned. So you don't just want to tune an instrument when it sounds bad. You want to have a regular maintenance schedule and make sure that it's really staying in pitch. As most piano teachers, I know that's primarily who will be watching this, no. So now I'm going to move to that last string. I'll take out my mute. Like I said, I recommend that you mute and tune to just one string. I'm going to just do it with all three at a time. Usually if I'm tuning, I'm actually tuning, listening to two strings at a time, even if they're both out of tune. And that's a skill that greatly speeds up what you're able to do. But we're going to do. There it is, a little above. Hold it. And we set that one really easily. And there's that sound now with the E. A little sharp. Definitely going to be going back for that to the ear. It sounds good. I'm sure if I let it hold out and wasn't in such a rush too, this piano tends to drift a little bit more flat as it holds out. So that's the general technique of tuning. Like I said, and I'm going to remind you again, make sure you inspect your instrument first. Be checking for the rust at those pin bases. Be checking back over here. We're going to just talk about a few things here. I'm checking comments, and it looks like we don't have any questions. Again, if you have questions, feel free to put those up so that way I can address anything that might be interesting to you. I'm just going to switch over my iPad for a moment. So setting pins, getting used to how things feel, how to anchor on different instruments, it takes a lot of practice. It takes hundreds and hundreds of hours of just really getting used to what that feel is and what that finesse is and how to adjust when you get to a different instrument that where maybe the pins move a little bit differently. So what makes your instrument go out of tune? Obviously, as the strings sit there, they begin to relax. Most instruments tend to fall flat over time. You have environmental changes that happen. The most important of those being the humidity. Temperature has a bit of an effect. The more important one is the humidity. Usually temperature and humidity coincide with each other, and that's why we think of those temperature changes as being times of the season. You know, here in a four-season area, we think about getting piano tuned after the heat kicks on, and then in the spring when the weather starts to change. Those are the times when you get the greatest changes in humidity. So that can make them make those change a lot. If you're not maintaining your pins and your tuning and your pin is slowly starting to spin under the pressure of that string, and we start letting things drop and losing our notches, we're not maintaining our instrument, you can do damage to the parts of the pin block, either just the hole that it's set in itself, or we'll talk about some things that can happen to the pin block itself. And you may have an instrument that the pin just turns really, really easily. Something that your technician is probably aware of, and there's things that they can do to fix that. If you have an instrument that's been tuned very, very flat, and I would say if you're 15 cents or more flat, I wouldn't attempt to tune on your own right now. That could be a drastic move for your instrument, depending on what it is. That's one that I would leave for your technician. A technician should be able to perform a pitch pull for you, and that's a little bit more involved and requires actually tuning the instrument sharp on purpose and being extra sensitive in the manner and the way in which you do it, so that way that instrument while you're there falls back into place and then gets touched up again and left in pitch. I know you've heard maybe you've heard a tuner say that they've got to bring it up gradually and they're going to do it a little bit more. Well, that's a way you can do it too, but it can be done in one setting. But in either case, if you're trying to get through this pandemic and you're trying to do a little fix on your own, if your instrument is 15 cents flat or more, maybe just make it sound good where it is, and then wait for your technician and say, I know it was, really flat, and they should bring it up to pitch for you. That's their job when they come, is not just to make an instrument that sounds in tune with itself, but to get an instrument that's right at that standard of 440 or 442, or any other standard that might be applicable to your situation there. So a couple other things that we're going to talk about. I talked about some things that could happen to the pin block and the holes, and I mentioned earlier, dust is the absolute enemy of your piano. Dust can get inside these pins as tight as they feel, as hard as they were to turn on this instrument. Dust can get inside those, and that will make your pins slip. That can create an instrument that goes out of tune. That can dry out the wood inside the hole in that pin block and eventually end up leading to cracking. If it gets humid, that dust can hold on to moisture. It can create rot in the wood, or it can create mold on the felts. So keeping a clean instrument is very, very, very important. There's some simple things that you can do to keep your instrument clean. First, close your grands, close your pianos. I know I'll do the same thing too. They look nice when they're open, but close them up. That dust can't get inside as easily when your instrument's closed up. Your keys, between all 88 of them, there's space. Close your cover boards. Close those fall boards over your keys. That dust gets underneath those keys, and once it's inside and sound starts being made, it moves around, it bounces around, and it's going to get into places. It's going to get into your action, and it can cause things to rot. Straps, little bridle straps, which I'm not doing anything with the action, they rot and they break. Then your keys don't reputate the way that they should. All sorts of damage can be caused by dust, and just by leaving the dust out can do a world of good for your instrument. Any humidity control that you have to help keep things more stable, that's going to be good for your instrument. Those are all preventative things that can save you a lot of money on your valuable teaching and performing tool that you make a living off of. So besides just closing your lid, there are some things that you can do that are really easy, so that way you can get the dust out of your instrument when you see it there. Perhaps the most non-intrusive way, but a little bit of a messy way that you could do it, is you could use a vacuum. And you could put it on, if you have a vacuum, like a shop vac, where you can blow out as well as suck up any debris. If you put it on the blower, you just blow that stuff out of there, and then you close up your instrument and then clean up your room. If you've got one of those nice little Roombas, I was actually talking about my wife with this with something else. In our house, we've got those heating radiators, and dust can get inside. Blow it out before bed. The Roomba runs at night, and can pick all that stuff. Of course, it's going to go flying, but it's an easy way that you can get some of that dust out of there. Just make sure you don't have some crazy powered thing that's going to be bending things and all that. You can use a vacuum. You can dust with a vacuum. I just have a little vacuum here. I usually use a shop vacuum, but you can use a vacuum with a brush and just get in between those keys and brush and vacuum as you go. I picked up quite a bit in there. On just this on this instrument, which is cleaned pretty regularly. Dust happens pretty quickly, especially I have a dog. Under normal circumstances, people are coming in and studying on this piano and carrying things in on their feet or whatnot. So you can use a vacuum. You can use a vacuum on your dampers as well, but never. I think you can see the dampers. Yes, you can. never go this way. You don't want to move side to side. You just want to gently go over those dampers parallel to the strings. Those dampers are attached by a metal rod. And if you bend that rod, your damper's not going to sit properly. Or even if it does still fall into the grooves that's been made and that rod's bent, you'll know when one of those rods is hitting a vibrating string, because you'll hear, and you'll be asking your technician or wondering, what is that annoying buzz every single time that I play? So those are things that you can do for the pins, for the dampers. Your technician can pull your action out and knows how to brush it and clean it and get the dust out of the action if it's accumulated in there. But the soundboard itself, I'm just going to show you quickly something that you can do with a rag. And I showed this in the video, the information video. You can order these online. This is a tuning swab, or I'm sorry, not a tuning swab, a cleaning swab for soundboard. And it's got the little hole, which I usually don't use, that you can put your rag into. I don't use it because I worry about the end. Even though this was made for pianos, I don't want to scratch the nice looking Sitka spruce of the soundboard. So you wrap it over. If you have a flexible, like a thin stick, you could use that, or a piece of PVC. Just no matter what you use, make sure that you can protect the end. So when you start moving this thing, you're not going to scratch. But what's nice about this is it can go in between your strings. We can go down inside, and we can push a rag on it. So with this rag here, I'm going to put the product I like to use. It's called Howard's Feed and Wax. It's a natural product made with beeswax. Has a nice lemon scent to it, so it smells good. If you have not a black lac finish, but if you have any of those standard wood finishes on your piano, you put just a little bit of this on the rag and you wipe it. It goes a long way in cleaning up your instrument. If you have light scratches, it'll help make them disappear. So that's something that you can easily do. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to apply a little bit of this inside. I actually have a rag. I tried not to be gross, and I used a new rag for this. But I have a rag that I used all the time that's just really well waxed. And then after I pull it out an instrument, I vacuum anything that's stuck on it, which you're going to want to do too. But I put this wax in, rub it to get it on the instrument. And there's a few places that you can enter. Now, if I was doing a full cleaning job for somebody, I would have the action out, and I'd be able to go actually from where the key bed is behind, and I can reach up in the side and I can enter over there. But I'm going to switch over my camera for just a little bit and show you. Now, you don't have to do this quite as often on an upright, because it's not going to stick to the soundboard quite the same way when it's vertical, but it can be done on an upright as well. But over to the side, I've got this opening that I can get to. Of course, you have these tone holes here that you're able to get to the back spot. So if I get this rag in here, and for right now I'm just going to use the stick, the swab, and I'm just going to feed it through. See if I can do this with one hand. Again, I'm being very careful that I don't touch the wood with the bare metal. And I feed that swab in. It's obviously easier places to enter than this, but for the sake of time and finding a spot that I can keep the camera on for you. You see why I like that rag that has the wax all over it, because then I don't have to try to maneuver it to get the spot that I just waxed. The rag that I'm used to using has so much wax all over it still. And then that's it. Once I'm in there, I use the swab now to start feeding it through. Again, being very careful not to touch the soundboard with the stick, just because I wouldn't want to scratch the nice looking spruce. And then when I get it to a point where it comes out, or I move it all around, especially if it was a real dirty piano, I'll take that rag and I'll put it in the vacuum, get anything that's loose off it, put maybe a little bit more on it, unless it's my nice dirty rag that I have that's nice and nice and waxed up, and then continue cleaning. You'll be surprised if this has never been done to your grand, if you take the time to do this with the swab and that product, how beautiful your soundboard is that might have been covered in dust, and you're doing a world of good for your instrument by not having that dust sitting on your piano. So that's one of the things that I recommend that you do. Keep a clean instrument, keep it closed. I do see a question or comment here, so I'm just gonna peek before I get to my last thing here. So I see somebody has a question about how many mutes they should have considered buying. So, and the tuning app that I use. So I'll make sure that I cover that before we wrap up. A couple other things that I didn't mention, but that I said I would have today. And I'll just switch over the camera one last time for you. Sorry, a little stall out here. Having some Gorilla Glue, very, very good to have on hand, especially if you've got an instrument that has, just a little laminate over top of it. Student walks in, they rub against something, a little piece chips off. You put a little bit of this on, and then you clamp it and put some pressure in. As long as you're really delicate, you can make it look like it never happened. Minwax sells the little stain markers. It's good to know the finish of your piano and to have one of those things on hand for covering things up. Like I said, that product, the Howard's Wax and Feed, if you don't have a glossy or high shine piano and you've got just a regular wood finish, it's going to make it look really, really nice if you just put a light coating on that. And some of your scratches are going to come off as well with that. Some people use the little Tibetan sticks, and you can buff out little scratches with that. The other thing I recommend that you have on hand, I just happen to use Gorilla because it works really well. So not promoting Gorilla necessarily, but the Gorilla Glue, just the little clear glue, could be useful for your keys if you've got an older instrument, if you've got one where the ivories tend to pop off. If you put that down and then you clamp it, you use the glue, the clear, not the white. If you use the white, you're going to see it through the key. You're going to see where it glued, and that's going to ruin it. When it comes to cleaning your keys, especially right now, if you are opening your studio or you live in an area where you're able to, and you open up your studio, you're going to be disinfecting your keys. Be careful what you're using on it. Things like Clorox wipes and all that stuff, you don't want to get that on the wood. If you have plastic keys, which most pianos do nowadays, it's not going to hurt anything if you're using that. But if you have ivory keys, you don't want to be putting anything like that on. That's going to end up being corrosive to the organic ivory. So hydrogen peroxide is probably the best disinfectant you could use to clean your keys, not only to make them look a little bit better, but also to make them safe and disinfect them between students if and when you're opening up. Definitely don't use Clorox or alcohol-based things on ivory keys if you have those, because that definitely has the potential to do some damage or to end up eating through or pitting on those keys. So in response to one of the questions that we have, how many mutes do you need to have? I didn't bring my whole case out here because I had kind of a limited space, but under normal circumstances, this is what I keep in just the little tuning bag along with the screwdriver. Now, I don't go in without bringing a whole case full of tools of things that I commonly need, as you probably have seen with your technician. But I've got a treble mute. I've got 3 mid mutes, and I have bass mute. Honestly, if you're just going to be doing some touch-up at home, having a mid and a bass mute is probably all that you need. Bass mute's important when the strings start to get fatter to properly mute it. On this instrument, I could do the whole thing with just the standard mid mute and the bass mute. Having more just comes to your system if you're doing entire pianos and you're going through them quickly, or, you know, in particular, the 3 mid mutes that I usually am carrying with me. If I'm tuning that mid section of the piano, I start with a unison, say an A. I'll put the other one on the other A. I'll tune that. I'll move it over. I'll tune the octave. I'll have the mute there. I'll prep the 5th. I'll check it with that one if I need to adjust it. So I'm strategically placing them ahead so that way I can be quicker. And I know I got picked on when, you know, I was first taking lessons and doing my apprenticeship, because just the way I would use my mute when you're doing a whole piano would slow down the process so much. I wanted to be careful, of course. I wanted to do it right, which is always the most important thing. But I would take my mute, I'd pull it out. I'd finish a key, I'd pull it out. Then I'd be thinking, what's my next key? And I think of all the seconds, 2, 3, 4 seconds wasted on each key. Doesn't sound like much, but there's 88 keys. Most of them have 3 strings, some of them have 2, a few on the end have 1. In no time at all, you're adding tens of minutes to the total job just because you're pulling out mutes. So short answer. You only really need to have bass mute and a mid mute just for doing a little touch up. If you're going to be serious, you're going to want, you know, at least what I mentioned here, plus more, because if you're doing it regularly, you're gonna wear them down. They're gonna dry out and start to break over time, especially when you start doing some dirty pianos. And there are a lot of dirty pianos out there. I think, oh yeah, there was another part to your question. What's the tuning app that I use? I can actually go back here and I'll actually show you right on the iPad here to make sure I get the right name. So up in the corner, I've got my iPad. I know it's probably a little small on your screen, but ClearTune is the tuning app that I use. And it's really just the software. It's clear. It's easy to read. I don't have any trouble with it. It's the hardware of the iPad itself that I trust. So I know that I'm getting a good result with that. I did mention the Korg Orchestral Tuner. That's an outstanding tuner if you're going to use a regular tuner. And then the vibration tuner, the Peterson strobe, is very useful as well, especially if you're in a situation where, you know, it might be a little bit noisy, where you've got to tune. And you also have the advantage of seeing harmonics, which, you know, sometimes I'll use that just on an older piano. There's a lot of corrosion on the strings, and you're hearing a lot of harmonics and want to be able to read what the pitch is at a different level. That can work out very nicely. So I hope that answers your question that you had there. Obviously, you know, please subscribe to channel if anybody asks any questions. Perhaps I can make a future video, but my main purpose was really, I know that people can't. I haven't been tuning because in the state of New York, business has been shut down, and we're waiting for professional services to open up in my particular area. So anybody that's teaching out there right now really couldn't have a tuner come out to them as of yet. In some areas that's the case, in other areas be longer. I hope when we reopen that people start calling right away, but people may be apprehensive too. So from the tuning side, I know that we're not out there tuning, but that means that while you're out there teaching online, you're not having anybody tune. So hopefully the portions of this were helpful to you, and you learned some preventative things about your instrument that you'll just increase the lifespan of your instrument. So yep, thanks so much, and thank you for the thank you that we saw in there. Take care. Be sure to check out my website and subscribe, and feel free to contact if you have any questions or need any guidance because you have curiosity and want to learn a little bit more. Thanks so much.